Alexandria in the year 250 BC was one of the greatest cities on Earth. Located on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, it stood as a powerful symbol of knowledge, trade, and cultural exchange in the ancient world. Founded less than a century earlier by Alexander the Great, the city had already grown into a vibrant metropolis where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and many other cultures mixed in ways rarely seen before in history. At this time, Alexandria was not just a city. It was the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, a place where scholars gathered to study the universe, merchants exchanged goods from distant lands, and monumental architecture reflected the ambition of an empire that stretched across continents. The story of Alexandria begins in 331 BC, when Alexander the Great arrived on the Egyptian coast after conquering the Persian Empire. Recognizing the strategic importance of the location between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile Delta, he ordered the construction of a new city that would serve as a gateway between Egypt and the Greek world. The design of Alexandria followed the principles of Greek urban planning. Wide, straight streets crossed the city in a grid pattern, making navigation easier and allowing space for markets, temples, palaces, and public buildings. One of the most remarkable features of Alexandria was its harbor. In fact, the city had two harbors separated by a long causeway called the Heptastadion, which connected the mainland to the island of Pharos. This engineering project not only protected ships from strong Mediterranean winds, but also created one of the busiest maritime centers of the ancient world. By 250 BC, ships arrived daily carrying grain from the fertile lands of the Nile, papyrus from Egyptian workshops, spices from Arabia, ivory from Africa, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. Trade turned Alexandria into an economic powerhouse. Merchants from Greece, Phoenicia, Rome, Judea, and North Africa walked the same streets and spoke dozens of different languages. Markets were filled with goods that had traveled thousands of kilometers. This intense commercial activity made Alexandria one of the richest cities of the Hellenistic era. Yet trade was only one part of the city's importance. Alexandria also became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. At the heart of this intellectual life stood the famous Library of Alexandria, part of a larger institution known as the Mausoleum. The Mausoleum functioned almost like a research institute or early university where scholars lived, worked, and studied together under royal patronage. The rulers of Egypt at this time were the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Ptolemies understood that knowledge could bring prestige and power. They invested heavily in collecting texts from across the known world. Ships arriving at the harbor were sometimes required to surrender any books they carried so that copies could be made for the library. Over time, the Library of Alexandria gathered hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, and literature. Scholars traveled from distant lands to study there. Some of the greatest minds of antiquity worked in Alexandria around this period. Euclid developed the foundations of geometry. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using observations of shadows and simple mathematical reasoning. Astronomers studied the movement of stars and planets, while physicians examined the human body in ways that were rare in other parts of the ancient world. Knowledge was debated, written, and shared in the halls of the Mausoleum, making Alexandria the intellectual engine of the Hellenistic age. The architecture of the city reflected its wealth and ambition. Marble columns lined public buildings. Temples dedicated to Greek and Egyptian gods stood side by side. The royal palace district occupied a large portion of the waterfront and included gardens, halls, and residences for the Ptolemaic rulers. Perhaps the most famous structure of Alexandria was the Lighthouse of Pharos. Built on the island connected to the mainland by the Heptastadion, this lighthouse guided ships safely into the harbor. Rising more than 100 meters above the sea, it was one of the tallest man-made structures in the world at the time, and later became recognized as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its light, produced by a fire burning at the top and reflected by polished metal mirrors, could be seen from far out at sea. For sailors approaching the Egyptian coast, the lighthouse was the first sign of the great city waiting beyond the horizon. Life in Alexandria was diverse and dynamic. The city was divided into several districts, each with its own communities and traditions. Greeks formed the political and cultural elite, but large populations of Egyptians and Jews also lived within the city. Alexandria's Jewish community was one of the largest in the ancient world. It was here that Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek in a work known as the Septuagint, allowing Greek-speaking populations across the Mediterranean to access Jewish religious texts. Cultural exchange happened everywhere in the city. Philosophers debated ideas in public squares. Teachers instructed students in rhetoric, mathematics, and astronomy. Artists created sculptures blending Greek realism with Egyptian symbolism. Even religion reflected this mixture. The god Serapis, for example, was introduced by the Ptolemies as a deity that combined elements of Greek and Egyptian beliefs, helping unify the diverse population of the city. The streets of Alexandria were alive with movement. Fishermen returned to the harbor at dawn with their catch from the Mediterranean. Merchants opened stalls selling grains, oils, fabrics, and pottery. Scholars walked toward the Mausean carrying scrolls and notes. Sailors from distant lands told stories of their voyages in crowded taverns near the docks. Camels carried goods arriving from caravans that had traveled across deserts from Africa and the Middle East. The sound of many languages echoed through the markets and ports. Yet despite its prosperity, Alexandria was also a city shaped by political power. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt from this city for nearly 3 centuries. Their court controlled the economy, the military, and the cultural institutions of the kingdom. Royal patronage allowed Alexandria to flourish as a center of learning and trade, but it also meant that the city's fate was tied closely to the stability of the ruling dynasty. By 250 BC, however, the Ptolemaic kingdom was still strong. Egypt's fertile lands produced enormous quantities of grain, which were exported across the Mediterranean. This agricultural wealth supported both the population of Alexandria and the ambitious projects of its rulers. The city's influence spread far beyond Egypt. Scholars educated in Alexandria traveled to other parts of the world carrying knowledge with them. Maps, scientific ideas, and literary works produced in the city shaped the intellectual traditions of the entire Mediterranean region. Alexandria stood at the crossroads of continents, connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe through trade and ideas. For many travelers arriving by sea, the city must have felt overwhelming. The massive lighthouse guiding ships into the harbor, the long causeway stretching toward the island of Pharos, the crowded docks filled with ships from distant lands, and beyond them a vast city of temples, libraries, palaces, and markets. In the ancient world, few places could rival its energy and importance. Alexandria in 250 BC represented something rare in human history. It was a place where commerce, science, culture, and power all converged in one city. Although centuries later the city would face wars, fires, and political change, its legacy would endure. The knowledge preserved and produced in Alexandria influenced generations of scholars and helped shape the intellectual foundations of Western and Middle Eastern civilizations. Even today, when historians speak of the ancient world, Alexandria remains one of its brightest symbols. A city born from the vision of Alexander the Great, transformed by the ambition of the Ptolemies, and remembered as the greatest center of learning and cultural exchange of the Hellenistic age.